Right, so we're back for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at something pretty raw and unfiltered. It's a Reddit thread,
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, it's about people's reactions to former President Trump's decision to pardon all those folks convicted for what went down at the Capitol riot on January 6th. And let me tell you, there's some pretty strong opinions flying around in this thread. You've got someone comparing voters to like disposable socks, and another person's talking about escaping to a multiversal timeline. You really get a sense of how much of an emotional roller coaster this whole thing has been for people. But
Yeah.
putting those kind of catchy phrases aside for a sec, what's the bigger picture here? What are people really trying to say?
That's what's so interesting about this. We're not looking at some carefully worded statement or a press release here. Is people reacting in the moment. It's like a live feed of public sentiment. We get to see how this event is hitting people where it counts.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like people are too thrilled about it. The thread even mentions a poll that says a whopping 83% of Americans don't approve of these pardons. But what really gets me is the why behind that disapproval.
I agree. It's not enough to just know people are upset, right?
Yeah.
We need to dig deeper and understand what's driving that disapproval. Like, what values are being challenged here? What fears are being triggered?
Well, there's definitely a lot of anger directed at the people who voted for Trump. Many are saying they feel betrayed, like they were tricked, or that they just chose to ignore all the warning signs. There's this one comment that really stuck with me. Someone actually compared voters to disposable socks, used and then tossed aside. I mean, that's a pretty powerful image, don't you think? It really captures that feeling of being used and discarded.
It is, yeah. That analogy really hits hard because it points to a deeper sense of disillusionment. It's not just disagreeing with the policy, it's about feeling like your voice, your vote.
Mhm.
It's like none of it actually matters in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and beyond that sense of betrayal, there's this real fear about what the future holds. A lot of commenters are drawing parallels to historical examples of fascism.
Mm.
They're warning about the potential consequences of Trump's actions. They're talking about the erosion of trust in our democratic institutions, feeling helpless and even afraid. One person even said, facts have no meaning or purpose anymore.
That one really hit me hard. It's like they're saying that even truth itself is under attack.
And you know that fear isn't totally unfounded. We've seen throughout history how that kind of erosion of trust, combined with this disregard for facts, it can create a breeding ground for authoritarianism. The fact that people are making these connections even in a casual setting like Reddit, it suggests a deep-seated anxiety about the future of American democracy. It's heavy stuff, for sure. It makes you wonder if we're at some kind of historical turning point. And what does all this mean for the average person? I mean, think about your own reaction to these events. Do you see these same patterns playing out in your own circles? Do you share these concerns? Or maybe you have a different perspective. It's important to think about these questions, because they really do affect all of us.
What I find particularly fascinating is how this event has become this sort of lightning rod for all these broader societal anxieties that are bubbling under the surface. It's not just about the pardons themselves. It's about what they represent in the grand scheme of American politics.
And speaking of getting into the nitty-gritty, let's take a closer look at some specific examples from this Reddit thread. Examples that really bring these anxieties to life.
Yeah, let's dive deeper into those raw voices and see what else we can uncover. We've talked about the raw emotions, the anger, the fear. But let's maybe shift gears a little and look at the mechanics behind all of this. Presidential pardons. What exactly are they, and why are these particular pardons causing such a stir?
Yeah, it seems like this power to pardon is a pretty big deal. The president can just wipe the slate clean for federal crimes just like that. That's a lot of power for one person.
It is a significant power, that's for sure. It's granted to the president by the Constitution itself. It allows them to essentially forgive federal crimes, give someone a clean slate, a fresh start. But it's not a completely unlimited power. There are checks and balances in place.
Oh, so there are limitations. What are they?
Well, for example, the power to pardon only applies to federal offenses. State crimes are totally outside the president's reach. And another thing a pardon can't do is shield someone from impeachment. That's a political process, not a criminal one.
Interesting. So there's a lot of nuance to this whole pardon power. How do the January 6th events and these specific pardons fit into this legal framework then?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated, shall we say, and concerning for a lot of people. Some of the individuals pardoned were convicted of really serious offenses, things like seditious conspiracy, which is directly challenging the authority of the government. So by pardoning them, some people argue that Trump actually undermined the rule of law and sent a dangerous message that attacking democratic institutions can go unpunished.
There's a comment in this thread that brings up Article 14 of the Constitution. It says that someone's disqualified from holding office if they provided aid and comfort to enemies of the state. Could that apply to these pardons?
That commenter brings up a really interesting point. It highlights how these pardons have stirred up questions about the very foundation of our government. Article 14 does address this issue, but applying it to presidential pardons is legally very complex. It would require further interpretation by the courts to see if it actually fits this situation.
So legally, it's a bit of a gray area. But what about the political fallout? What message do these pardons send beyond just the legal stuff?
Politically, a lot of people see these pardons as a way to reward those who were loyal to Trump, those who took part in the January 6th attack. Critics argue that it further erodes trust in the justice system, creates this perception that there's one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else.
Right, and as we've seen in this Reddit thread, there's this deep worry about what this means for American democracy going forward. A lot of people are drawing parallels to times in history when things shifted towards authoritarianism. And it's pretty unsettling to see those comparisons being made.
It is unsettling, but it also shows that people are engaged, they're thinking critically about history and how it might repeat itself. When you see people who tried to overturn a democratic election being pardoned, it raises some serious questions about the future of our democratic norms and the peaceful transfer of power, which are supposed to be the cornerstones of our system.
Okay, so we've got legal questions, political fallout, fears about the future. It's a lot to take in. And then you add in social media, which seems to amplify everything. How do these events connect to the role of social media in shaping public opinion these days?
That's a crucial part of this whole discussion, I think. Social media has become the main source of information for so many people. It's a blessing and a curse.
How so? I mean, we're having this conversation because of a social media thread, so it can't be all bad, can it?
Well, you're right. This thread does give us a glimpse into people's immediate reactions and thoughts. But the thing is, social media algorithms often create these echo chambers, where people are mostly exposed to information that reinforces what they already believe. This can lead to more polarization and make it harder to have meaningful conversations with people who hold different views.
Yeah, we see that happening in this Reddit thread. People digging in their heels, throwing accusations around, dismissing any opposing viewpoints. It feels like there's no middle ground anymore.
Exactly. And the anonymity and the sheer speed of online communication, it kind of makes things worse. People might feel less restrained about expressing extreme views or resorting to personal attacks when they're hidden behind a screen. And the speed at which information or misinformation travels is just mind-blowing.
Which brings us back to that quote, facts have no meaning or purpose anymore. Is that a result of being constantly bombarded with information 24/7?
Yeah, that feeling of information overload is a real thing. It's tough for people to sift through all the noise and figure out complex issues when they're constantly hit with conflicting information from all sides.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to navigate this online political landscape? It feels like everyone's shouting, but no one's listening.
It's definitely a challenging environment, no doubt. But it's not hopeless, I don't think. One key thing is to develop critical thinking skills, learning how to evaluate sources, recognize biases, and be wary of information that seems too good to be true. It's about taking a step back and asking, what's the agenda behind this information? Who benefits if I believe this?
So we need to be more aware of the information we consume and share. It's not just about being informed, it's about being informed critically.
Precisely. We can't just passively absorb information. We need to actively engage with it, question it. And while it's important to be informed about what's happening right now, we also need to connect those events to larger trends, to historical patterns. That's what helps us understand the bigger picture.
So critical thinking and historical context are key. Let's shift gears a bit and dive into those historical patterns. How does what we're seeing today connect to these broader societal trends?
Okay, so we've explored all those raw emotions surrounding these pardons. We dug into the legal and political complexities, and we even talked about how social media shapes public opinion. But as we start wrapping up this deep dive, I think it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. How do these events connect to those broader societal trends and historical patterns? What's the takeaway here? What does all of this tell us about where we stand as a society today? Well, one trend that's pretty hard to ignore is this rise of populism and nationalism. And it's not just happening in the US, it's a global phenomenon. We're seeing more and more support for leaders who prioritize emotion over reason, leaders who offer simple solutions to really complex problems. And often, those solutions involve scapegoating certain groups or even undermining democratic norms.
Hmm, that does sound familiar. Trump's rhetoric often tapped into those feelings of anger and resentment, blaming elites or outsiders for all the country's problems. It's a tactic that's been used throughout history, right?
Exactly. This wave of populism is driven by a mix of things: economic anxiety, these rapid social and cultural changes, and a growing sense that people have that traditional institutions just aren't working for them anymore. So when people feel like the system's failing them, they're more likely to be drawn to leaders who promise radical change, even if those promises are unrealistic or potentially dangerous.
And this ties back to that declining trust in institutions that we see all over this Reddit thread. People are losing faith in the government, the media, science even. It's almost like the very foundation of our society is crumbling.
That's a major concern, that erosion of trust. When people lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to serve them, it creates this void, this vacuum. And history shows us time and time again that those vacuums are often filled by demagogues, conspiracy theories, and extremist ideologies.
It's like that saying, nature abhors a vacuum, right? If people don't have sources of information and leadership that they can trust, they'll find it somewhere, even if those sources are unreliable or even harmful.
Yeah.
And all those comparisons to historical examples of fascism in the Reddit thread, they're pretty unsettling, to say the least.
Yeah, those comparisons, while they might be a bit exaggerated sometimes, they do highlight a very real concern. We can't just brush them off as paranoia. History teaches us that democracies are fragile, and they need constant protection from those who want to exploit fear and division for their own benefit.
So given all this, where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do to navigate this complex and honestly kind of frightening political landscape? It's easy to feel overwhelmed, powerless even.
It is overwhelming, I agree. But we can't just give up and become apathetic or cynical. Our voices and actions really do matter, even if it doesn't always feel that way. We have to stay informed, engage in constructive dialogue, and hold our leaders accountable. We need to support the institutions that uphold those democratic values, even when those institutions are imperfect.
That sounds like a call to action. But where do we even begin? How do we bridge those divides that seem to be tearing us apart? I mean, this Reddit thread is like a miniature version of those divisions, and it's not exactly a hopeful picture.
You're right, bridging those divides won't be easy. It takes empathy, patience, and a willingness to truly listen to those who we disagree with. It means being committed to finding common ground, even when it seems impossible. But we have to try. The alternative is just too scary to even think about.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question, a challenge even. What are some concrete steps that each of us can take to bridge those divides in our society and create a space for constructive dialogue? It's a question worth thinking about, one that demands our attention, I think.
And remember, the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make, each and every day. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never underestimate the power of your voice.
That's all for our deep dive today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.